Hey everyone, welcome back. Today isn't just one story. Today we're comparing 3 internet stories about entitled people who all made the same mistake in very different ways. One thought a pool hall belonged to him. One decided shouting, "Do you work here?" was an acceptable way to talk to a stranger. And one laughed when asked for basic courtesy from a neighbor. Same problem, different setting, and very different consequences. Let's see which one pushed their luck the farthest. The best trick shot I ever saw wasn't on the table. It was watching a pool hall bully get lit up by cops after we made a few calls. This happened a little over 20 years ago, back when my friends and I were in our early 20s and thought hanging out at a local pool hall counted as having a personality. It was the mid-2000s, the era of cargo pants, cheap domestic beer, and Nextel phones that made you feel important just by chirping someone across the room. None of us had much money, but we had time, and that was enough. Our regular spot was a small billiards place in a neighboring town that quickly became part of our routine. The place itself wasn't fancy in any way. It had a handful of pool tables, a bar running along one wall, TVs mounted up high playing whatever game happened to be on, and a tiny outdoor patio where people went to smoke. You could rent a table by the hour or drop quarters in for a single game, which was perfect for killing an evening. It was relaxed, affordable, and usually drama-free, which is why we kept going back. For the first few months, everything was smooth. We'd grab a table, play a few games, talk trash, watch sports, and generally just exist without anyone causing problems. There were no territorial arguments, no weird power plays over tables, and no one acting like they owned the place. That peaceful stretch lasted about 3 months, right up until the night this guy showed up. He didn't come in loud or aggressive at first, which somehow made him worse. He had that walk that suggested the room owed him something, a leather jacket, and a half smirk that never left his face. You could tell immediately he was one of those guys who thought pool halls were his natural habitat. At one point, my friends and I stepped away from our table to grab drinks and talk for a few minutes. When we came back, he was already lining up a shot on what had been our table. At first, we didn't care much. Tables rotated all the time, and we weren't in a rush. About 20 minutes later, one of my friends walked over and said, "Hey man, we were hoping to grab next game." The guy didn't even look up, just waved his hand and muttered, yeah, in a tone that clearly meant no. When he finished that game, he immediately racked again and started another round without saying a word. That's when I walked over myself and tried again, still polite. "Hey, we've been waiting. We'll take next game after this one." Before he could respond, a woman sitting nearby chimed in and said, "And I'm after them." He looked straight through both of us like we were part of the furniture and broke the rack. At that point, it was obvious this wasn't a misunderstanding. He was doing it on purpose. Eventually, he finished and walked away from the table, and we finally saw our opening. We dropped in our quarters, hit the release, and watched the balls roll out onto the felt. All of them came out, except the green 6 ball. At first, we thought it was stuck until one of my friends said, "Did he seriously take a ball?" We looked toward the bathroom and saw him heading in with a beer in one hand and the 6 ball in the other like it was a souvenir. We went to the manager and explained what happened. The manager sighed, glanced at the clock, and said it was already 12:30 and they were about to call last call. He didn't want to make a scene or kick someone out over a missing ball, especially that late. Instead, he handed us a replacement ball and told us to enjoy the last game. We appreciated it, but the situation was far from over. The guy came out of the bathroom, saw us playing, and smirked like a kid who'd gotten away with something. He wandered out to the patio to smoke, still holding his beer and still holding the original 6 ball. When he came back in, he walked straight up to our table and casually tossed the ball onto the felt, scattering a few balls we were lining up. "Oops," he said with a grin, before strolling up to the bar just in time for last call. That's when one of my friends leaned in and said quietly, "We should follow him home and call the highway patrol." This is the perfect turning point. You tried being reasonable, the manager tried avoiding conflict, and the guy just kept upping the disrespect. He thought he was untouchable, so you made sure the one system that doesn't play favorites got involved. At first we laughed because it sounded ridiculous, but the more we thought about it, the more it made sense. This was the early 2000s, DUI enforcement was aggressive. He'd clearly been drinking, and technically reporting a suspected drunk driver wasn't illegal. 3 of us agreed almost immediately, while the 4th volunteered to follow him instead of making the call. As soon as he left, we split up and coordinated using our Nextel push-to-talk phones like idiots in a low-budget spy movie. One by one, we called the highway patrol, each reporting the same car, make, model, color, license plate, but describing slightly different erratic behavior, swerving, nearly hitting another car, speeding up, slowing down unpredictably. The whole thing took less than 15 minutes, and we assumed he lived nearby since it was a neighborhood bar. Then the chirp came through. "He's pulled over," our friend said, barely containing his laughter. Cop slid right between us and lit him up. None of us went back to the bar after that. We just went home. A week later, one of my friends read the police blotter and saw it. A man arrested after multiple calls reporting erratic driving. He wasn't charged with DUI, but he was arrested for driving on a suspended license, which somehow made it even better. We never saw him at that pool hall again. I don't feel bad about it either. We didn't damage his car, we didn't force him to drive illegally, and we didn't lie about him drinking. All we did was make sure his behavior got attention. If he just rotated tables like a normal human instead of stealing a billiard ball like it was a power move, none of it would have happened. Turns out the best trick shot of the night was the one he pulled on himself. That's the mistake. He thought small acts of disrespect didn't count, but when you stack enough of them together, someone eventually stops being polite and starts being precise. What makes this funny is that nobody touched him, nobody yelled, and nobody lied. He managed to trip himself up without realizing the room had already moved on. And our second story. The entitlement of someone shouting, "Do you work here?" before even looking at what you're wearing never fails to astound me. This took place in the fall of 2015 at a Kroger-associated grocery store in the office supply aisle of all places. I remember the timing vividly because I was deep in the stress spiral that comes with applying to grad school. I was juggling deadlines, recommendation letters, transcripts, and the constant low-grade panic of feeling like every small mistake might derail my entire future. To cope with that anxiety, I'd latched onto one very specific task and decided it needed to be done perfectly. That task was buying folders. Not just any folders, but very specific folders. I needed ones with built-in 3-hole punch binding so my letter writers could easily keep all the information I'd given them together. I wanted them neat, professional, and uniform. It sounds ridiculous, but at the time, this felt like one of the only things I had control over. So there I was, laser-focused, rummaging through a large bin of folders that was inconveniently placed right at floor level. I was crouched down on the tile, fully committed, sorting through colors and styles like I was defusing a bomb. I'd already narrowed it down to a few contenders when I heard someone loudly shout something from further down the aisle. That didn't register the words at first, and honestly, even if I had, I probably would have ignored them. Grocery stores are noisy. People yell for spouses or kids all the time, and I was in my own head. I just about selected my final 3 folders when I suddenly became aware of a presence far too close for comfort. I hadn't heard footsteps approach, but when I looked up slightly, I realized there was a woman standing directly over me. And I mean directly over me. Her shoes were so close that the toes were nearly touching my skirt. She was fully inside my personal space, looming like she'd been waiting for a dramatic reveal. Before I could even react, she shouted straight down at me, "Do you work here?" Each word was punctuated, loud and dripping with impatience. The sound echoed in the aisle, and I felt that familiar rush of heat crawl up my spine. If you've ever worked customer service, you know the tone, that sharp, aggressive, already angry voice that assumes you're incompetent before you've even opened your mouth. I stayed perfectly still for a moment, still crouched on the floor, gripping my folders. Then I slowly turned my head to look up at her. I had already done my time in customer service hell. Barista, waitress, call center rep, the works. I'd been yelled at, insulted, blamed for things entirely outside my control, and talked down to by strangers who thought paying money entitled them to treat other people like garbage. That tone flipped a switch in me instantly. "No," I said flatly. This is the perfect quiet turning point. After being invaded and shouted out, that single, calm, flat no isn't just an answer, it's a refusal to play her game. It's the sound of someone who's had enough, delivered without the anger she expected, and it completely disarmed her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't soften it either. I just looked straight up at her and held eye contact, the kind of eye contact that says this interaction is already over. For a brief second, she just stared back at me, clearly recalibrating. It dawned on me then that she must have already shouted the same question at me from down the aisle earlier, and I hadn't even noticed, or had noticed and dismissed it subconsciously because I wasn't an employee and didn't owe a response. Something about my expression must have gotten through to her because she huffed, muttered something under her breath, and stomped off down the aisle in search of a more compliant target. I watched her go with a mix of relief and irritation, already feeling sorry for whatever poor employee she was about to unleash herself on. I went back to my folders, heart still thumping harder than it should have been over such a short exchange. As I checked out a few minutes later, I noticed the actual store employees moving around the front of the store. They were all wearing red and black uniforms, very clearly branded, very clearly identifiable. That's when it clicked. I was wearing a black top and an orangey red tropical print skirt. Apparently, that was enough for this woman to decide I was fair game, despite the lack of name tag, apron, or literally any indication that I worked there. I still think about that moment sometimes when I go back to that store. Not because I was especially dramatic, but because it was such a perfect snapshot of entitlement. The assumption that anyone nearby exists to serve you. The willingness to invade someone's space and shout at them without even waiting for a response. The absolute refusal to use basic observation skills before going nuclear. I like to imagine she never found whatever she was looking for that day, or that when she finally did, it was out of stock or discontinued, or behind a locked case that required pressing a button and waiting, just long enough for her to stew in her own impatience. What really disarms her isn't her attitude, it's the refusal to engage. She expected resistance or submission and got neither. And you could almost hear the gears grinding when that happens. And our last story. Neighbor laughed when I asked her to keep her kids quieter in the early a.m. She didn't find it funny when I started my revenge. I work late nights, not stay up scrolling on my phone late nights, but actual clock out at 2 or 3 in the morning late nights. Because of that, mornings are sacred to me. I sleep in, I have to. My schedule isn't flexible, and my body doesn't magically reset just because the sun comes up. Unfortunately, my neighbors do not care. They live right next door and have 3 young kids. I don't mean energetic but manageable kids. I mean full volume, no filter, backyard chaos every single morning starting around 7. Screaming, shrieking, running laps, slamming toys against fences, pounding on plastic playsets, yelling at each other like they're competing in some kind of endurance sport. And it's not occasional, it's daily. Weekdays, weekends, holidays, rain or shine. I want to be clear, I'm not anti-kid. I get that kids are loud sometimes. I get that backyards are for playing. But there's a difference between normal daytime noise and treating the early morning hours like a free-for-all while the rest of the neighborhood's still asleep. After weeks of being woken up by what sounded like a pack of caffeinated banshees, I finally decided to say something. I waited until a calm moment in the afternoon when everyone was outside, walked over, and approached my neighbor politely. I said something like, "Hey, I work late nights and the kids being out at 7 every morning's really rough. Would you mind keeping things a little quieter early on?" She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, they're early risers," she said, like she was explaining a quirky personality trait. "You'll get used to it." That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement, no attempt to meet me halfway, just a shrug and a dismissal, as if my sleep schedule was my personal failing. I stood there for a second, waiting for maybe a follow-up. Nothing came. She went back to whatever she was doing, and I went home feeling stupid for even trying. I tried to let it go. I bought earplugs, I ran a white noise machine, I closed windows, none of it mattered. Kids screaming directly outside your bedroom window cuts through everything, and knowing it was going to happen every single morning made it worse. The breaking point came on a Saturday. I'd worked a brutal shift the night before and finally fallen asleep around 4. At exactly 7 on the dot, the backyard erupted, screaming, a ball slamming repeatedly against the fence, one kid shrieking like they were being murdered over a toy dispute. I lay there staring at the ceiling, exhausted and furious, replaying her words in my head. "You'll get used to it." That's when I had an idea. The next day, I set my alarm for 6 a.m. I rolled out of bed, pulled on clothes, and went straight outside. I fired up my lawnmower and started cutting grass. Slowly, thoroughly, right along the property line we share. Once I finished mowing, I grabbed my leaf blower. If you've never used one early in the morning, they're basically portable jet engines. I walked the entire edge of my yard, blowing leaves that didn't exist, taking my time, enjoying the hum of petty satisfaction. This is the perfect turning point. You tried talking and got laughed at, so you stopped asking and gave her a taste of her own logic. About 10 minutes in, I saw movement next door. My neighbor came storming out in her pajamas, hair a mess, face twisted with pure rage. "What the hell are you doing?" she shouted over the noise. I shut off the blower, smiled, and said, "Oh, I'm an early riser. You'll get used to it." She stared at me like I'd slapped her. "This is so inconsiderate," she snapped. "My kids are still sleeping." I nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, mornings can be tough." She huffed, spun around, and went back inside. I finished my yard work in peaceful, noisy silence. Since then, things have gotten awkward. The kids still play, but not at 7, more like 9, occasionally earlier, but noticeably quieter. The screaming marathons have stopped. The fence pounding has mysteriously disappeared. However, word traveled fast. Another neighbor mentioned that I should have handled it like an adult. Someone else suggested I was being passive-aggressive. One even said, "Kids will be kids," like that magically absolves parents from teaching basic courtesy. Here's the thing, though. I did handle it like an adult. I communicated, calmly, politely. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't call the police or HOA or escalate things unnecessarily. I asked for a reasonable compromise and was laughed at. Apparently, being an adult only counts when you're the one expected to tolerate discomfort. I never asked them to keep the kids silent all day. I never demanded impossible standards. I asked for consideration during early morning hours. The same courtesy most neighbors quietly operate on without needing reminders. The moment the noise inconvenienced her, it was suddenly unacceptable. And no, I don't feel bad. I didn't damage anything. I didn't break any rules. Lawn maintenance at 6 a.m. is legal where I live. Loud kids at 7 are also legal. Funny how legality only matters when it's on your side. Now when I hear the kids outside mid-morning, I don't even mind it anymore. I sleep better. The house is quieter when it matters, and my neighbor avoids eye contact like I've personally betrayed her. Sometimes the only way to get through to people who dismiss your discomfort is to let them experience it firsthand. Not with cruelty, not with escalation, just with a mirror. Turns out early risers aren't so charming when they're not your own kids. All 3 stories end differently, but they share the same theme. Behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum. Story 1 is about arrogance meeting systems that don't care who you are. Story 2 is about entitlement collapsing under calm refusal. Story 3 is about empathy being learned the hard way. The strongest one depends on what you value most: clean consequences, personal boundaries, or balance. None of these people were forced into their outcome. They walked there themselves. Now it's your turn. Which story wins? Vote in the comments, 1, 2, or 3, and tell me why. I'm curious which kind of justice hits hardest for you. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a new video every single day. Thank you all for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.